Hey there, and welcome to Work Dope, a podcast on the messiness and the potential of humans at work. I'm Linda Stacy, and I'm a corporate sellout who likes to think of herself as a corporate innovator. And I think that working in corporate America doesn't have to suck, even though it often does. By some statistics, up to 80% of the workforce are dissatisfied at work. And on the flip side, the paradox here, research also shows that folks are expecting more and more to create meaning and purpose in their lives through their work. They're basing their identity on their roles. The pandemic and the Great Resignation, now the Great Regret, quiet quitting, all of these themes have forced us to take a look at quality of life and what culture really means for people inside of organizations. I do, in fact, think that business and organizational life can be really cool. I think that building things and solving real world problems and creating all of these are fundamental to the best parts of the human experience. This is how we embrace human potential. In this episode, I'm chatting with Danny Ceballos of Unleashed Consulting. Danny has more than 30 years of experience in training and leadership development. Danny has worked with organizations around the world to strengthen their effectiveness in leading and managing people and talent. Danny is deeply committed to social justice, diversity, and engaging the full human spirit at work. Danny is on a mission to change the world one manager at a time. I love this. Danny is fantastic. We started the conversation around the theme of the statistic of quitting the boss, that most people quit an organization. They quit because of their boss. And this is a true tragedy for organizations. There's so much lost potential here. More attention needs to be paid to middle managers, and they're really not getting the resources they need to do their jobs well. The theme of positive intelligence comes up here. Danny begins to lay out how this is identifying one's saboteurs and how we get in our own way, and then how we can learn to mitigate or manage those saboteurs, and at the same time develop our sage mind, our adult wise mind. This theme comes up in other episodes as well. We talk about performance reviews a bit. We talk about how they can be dangerous if they're only used like once a year in the annual form. He also talked about a better way to do for feedback and performance. And then we get into the feedback framework, creating a culture of feedback. And this is really how we grow, and themes of respect. And of course, we talk about what it means for Danny to be valued and seen in his work, and how leaning into the work of growth in your life is going to deeply impact how effective you are and how satisfied and how fulfilled you are at work and in life. One note I want to make, Danny refers to having driven the BMW towards the end of his time in corporate, and this threw me a little bit. Later, he defines it more clearly when he says this is the bitch, moan, whine vehicle that sometimes we are in the workplace. When, all we can do is bitch, moan, and whine about our circumstance. So that's just a little bit so you know at the outset what he's referring to. I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed having it with Danny. He is absolutely fantastic. Danny, thrilled to have you on Work Dope today. How are you?
I'm well. It's great to be here, Linda. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I am thrilled to have you. So I've read your formal bio in the intro preceding this conversation. I would love to hear from you how you describe what you do at a cocktail party, or maybe even to family members. How do you put it into context?
So I am in the business of leadership transformation. So I work with middle and senior managers so that they become the leaders that they want to be and that people want to work for. My field is organizational development. So that's the broader scope of the work that I do. So I am an executive coach, a management trainer, and a leadership consultant.
Awesome. Awesome. And tell me about your career history and maybe some inflection points that pointed or kind of got you where you are today.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. So there's an interesting statistic that's out there that's been around for a while, and it continues year after year to be substantiated. And that is that over 50% of people, when they are quitting their jobs, they're not quitting their work, they're quitting their boss. They're quitting their bosses, their management, their leadership. And what a shame that is, both for the company and the organization, but also for the individual. It's just an enormous waste of resources. So that was actually my experience. So I worked professionally in a corporate environment for about 20 years, working for the same company. It was a large healthcare nonprofit company. I was working all across the country with that. And also, I have an MBA from 100 years ago and a master's in organizational development. So I am very much about leading and managing, really love that role and working with people in that role. And then unfortunately, well, maybe not unfortunately, I ran into a new leader, a new boss, and unfortunately, they and I just could not see eye to eye on what was needed. So I became one of those folks that left work that I loved, an organization that I loved, and it was primarily because I was quitting my boss.
Mm.
So that continues to inform the work that I do. Again, I think it's a shame. And it's no fault on, anybody's part. I don't blame my old boss. I think they're terrific, absolutely terrific, but just that misalignment. So I think there was a real that was a real tragedy, and I think what I'm trying to do, or what I'm doing in my work, is to fight that tragedy so that it doesn't happen, so that organizations and companies can retain, keep, and motivate their folks when they bring them on. So we can, create this leadership pipeline, this leadership bench for organizations, instead of folks coming in, giving 110%, and then leaving discouraged and, just with bad will, because their leader was ineffective, or, ineffective in keeping and retaining these talented people. And what I just think there's such, it breaks my heart personally and professionally, because folks, I by and large want to shine in their work, right? They want to be appreciated, and it's not rocket science, but I find it really interesting, especially during this time, and I know we're going to be talking about this, but this time where we're looking at work and leadership and management, I think with a really good critical eye, and I think there's some real gifts and opportunities that are coming from this time.
How long was it between the time that you got this new boss and the time that you left?
That's a great question. I think it was about, well, it wasn't a year, but it was more than 6 months.
Okay.
So yeah, probably about 9 months.
And with your history and from what you described in our previous conversation, you had at that time all sorts of skills to manage within that, to navigate. If anyone knew like what to do given a not so great boss, it was you, right? But you still knew that this wasn't going to work.
Yeah. So it was a really tough time and a tough decision. So I tried to use all my skills, talents, strategies, tools, insights for managing up. Right. So that's a big part of the work that I did and that I do with clients, is about how to manage those relationships that, are by necessity challenging. There's nothing, this is good when we have, good, respectful challenge. That's how growth happens. That's how productivity happens. But at some point for me, it became a question of I was miserable. So I was miserable. I was driving the BMW, and the BMW was bitching, moaning, and whining. I was driving that car all the time, and it was not a good place for me. So it was, I have to say that even using all the tools and strategies and finding that they didn't work in the long run, that I stayed true to what I know and believe, and I think save myself and save the organization a lot of expensive trauma that would happen had I stayed. So expensive, right, for me, and expensive for the organization. So it was part of my managing this relationship was to be direct and honest and empathetic with my boss, and have that tough conversation about it's time for me to leave. And then for us to co-create a plan for what that would look like. Right. So I created my own SOP, my own standard operating procedure binder. And I think we both transitioned out of that respectfully and thoroughly. So
Yeah, perfect. So taking full ownership, using the skills that you knew, the best that you could. I'm very much around self-leadership and taking as much
yes, yeah,
responsibility as one can in any role that they have. And it's
yes.
just really interesting to hear this because, at the end of the day, that doesn't mean you stay. You do the best that you can, you bring it fully forward, and wow. And so how long have you been doing this now on your own?
Yeah, so I've been running Unleashed Consulting for about 7 years now.
Fantastic. So I'm excited to hear in any ways that it makes sense for you to talk about the
Hmm.
competencies, the programs that you built as we talk about these
Great.
awesome things that you help
Yeah. Yes.
individuals do. So positive intelligence is one category, right? That
Mhm.
you
That's right.
like to, yeah. Can you, for the novice, for someone who's never heard anything about this, how do you explain in a nutshell?
Sure. Yeah. Positive intelligence is this great body of work and research, uh, tools and strategies that what started with the work of Shirzad Shamin. So Shirzad is still the kind of the thought leader around this body of work and knowledge, and has created with his team, and it's becoming bigger and bigger, a terrific strategy for understanding for how leaders and individuals, as you said, and I'm 100% with you, we are all leaders in our own right, needing to lead ourselves, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's such a huge part of
Yeah.
the work that I do, is having folks understand how to best lead themselves. And so
Mm-hmm.
positive intelligence captures that, specifically around first identifying one's own saboteurs, or the sabotaging thoughts and feelings that we have, how we get in
Mm-hmm.
our own way,
Yeah.
understanding those, how to manage those, how to mitigate those, and at the same time, develop what we call our sage mind,
Mm,
which is the deeper, wiser, calmer,
mm.
more focused part of our mind. And one of the reasons that I'm such a believer in positive intelligence
Yeah.
and positive psychology,
Yeah. Yeah.
positive intelligence, is that it's all encompassing in a lot of ways. When you do the work, right, it's a very specific path. You create your own operating system
Mm.
for how to best manage and lead yourself. And it's based in neurophysiology
Yeah.
and the idea that are different parts of our brain.
Right.
So it's tamping down the limbic part of our
Yeah.
brain,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Enlivening the prefrontal cortex and the
Yes.
so anyway, so
No, that's beautiful. So
big nutshell.
this is so and it's different from positive
That's
psychology.
right. Exactly. Thank you.
So
Yes.
if you could say quickly what makes them
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. So positive psychology is actually it's the coaching basis that I was trained in. And positive psychology is about working with what is right and building on that. What is
Mm,
right, what is strong in our lives. So it's the positive
yeah.
part of our
Yeah.
lives,
Okay.
instead of what typically happens in life and
Yeah.
organization in Western society, which is to focus on what is wrong
Yeah.
and how to fix that.
Right.
And instead, positive psychology kind of reframes that. So very different.
Yeah.
So positive psychology is the larger, broader
Okay.
study of
Okay.
that, and
All right.
positive intelligence is a thin slice of that, if you
Yeah,
will.
and it almost sounds like it's a bunch of tools and themes around developing a strategy. And to me, all of this points towards freedom. Like at the end of the
Yes,
day, it's
indeed.
freedom and joy, but freedom and then understanding this concept. And I've talked about it on this podcast before, that no matter what we're seeking, underneath it for
Yeah,
any of us is likely freedom. And for some of us, we're seeking money, and that would equal freedom. And some of us, we're seeking a relationship, and that would equal freedom, or what all these things are. So what is the path to that, and taking responsibility on that path and that journey? So
indeed.
it's really fantastic.
I want to say, if I could, underscoring that you talk about is freedom, which I completely agree. And I always think of it as the dirty word of happiness, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and I only say it's a dirty word because it's a tough sell to work
Mm-hmm.
with corporate clients and say,
Mm-hmm.
hey, let's figure out how to make your people happier.
Right.
But I think I think it's a close cousin to freedom, if
Right.
it's not the same thing. But ultimately, how each of us defines our own happiness
Mm-hmm.
is, for me, that's the secret sauce of life, of,
Right.
and of productivity, right? Of
Right.
both professional art, is where are you in your integrity around your happiness?
Mm.
And it's interesting. I was just on a group call around positive intelligence, and we were talking about the importance of happiness. One of the things that was a real takeaway for me that I want to share with you and to share with the audience is this idea of being at choice at every moment and every hour and every day of our life, right? And the choices around and how you know, this is ideally, right? Ideally, this is what we work towards, is to be a choice so that we can choose and do the work that we need to do. Sometimes it's good work, easy work, sometimes it's play, to be happy, right? So all the time. And so I've been putting myself through that filter the past couple of days, just thinking, okay, at this point, am I doing what makes me happy or brings me happiness, right? And it's not the panacea, it's not the rose-colored glasses kind of happy. That's not it. It's the deep sense of I am at choice, doing what I choose to do and feeling how I choose to feel, and B, that it's serving me. So
that it's serving you. Absolutely. There's richness and context here. And again, themes we've talked about before, that happiness doesn't equate or isn't the same thing as fun. You know, that there are elements that make a rich life that do not all mean that, you know, it's and we wouldn't even want that. We need some contrast in our life in order to even understand what we want and what we're working towards.
Right. And I also think sometimes it's pursuing those opposite things, those challenges, those that I think bring us happiness or bring me, I'll just own my own stuff, right? So, you know, it's not just good times, right? I mean, I'm looking forward to something like that, you know, when I retire in my life. But right now it's being thoughtful with a colleague like you. I mean, that for me, that's fun, right? And or being in conversations where I am challenged and feel. I'm thinking about some conversation I've been having with my brother, who I love dearly, and it's really challenging, really challenging. That's happiness for me. It is, right? Because I'm growing, I'm learning, I'm leaning into it.
And the idea around challenge too is it's part of life and our experience, and it is a route from which we can grow.
There's a premise in positive intelligence that I really love. There's some fundamental beliefs, and one of that really kind of serve as the grounding for it. And one of those is that in every challenge we face, there is a gift and or an opportunity. It's not always clear. A lot of times it's a heavy weight. It takes a long time before I fundamentally believe that and use that in my life now, no matter how challenging the circumstances are, right? That there is something in there. I just need to keep believing that it's there, and eventually it will show itself.
And I do want to acknowledge too that there are situations that can go on for extremely long period of time that don't seem to make any sense. And I just think it's just, it certainly isn't easy.
No, that's right. And it's not meant to minimize, the tragedies that we all have, or will have in our lives. But the belief is strong. The belief is it's that there is something in there. And it's usually in the form of new knowledge, new power, or inspiration. That's really helpful for me too. And I want to encourage you and your listeners to think about when you're facing something and there's some, what can I bring from this? And sometimes it's almost like we're in training, like a Jedi training, if you will, right? So that's another important thing for me. When you're dealing with a boss or whoever that's challenging, is if you can reframe that as what can I learn from this experience? What's this training that will prepare me? So I'm stronger and better for the next time this happens, right? And then there's value in every challenging conversation.
I think there can be a little bit of wonder as you ask that question. If you can remove like the angst of the moment, and you could say, I wonder what I meant to learn, and then kind of let it go. Be open to having the world show you at a later time what it was meant. I think sometimes we get so like we want to figure it out like right now with our mind energy, and sometimes time needs to pass, and we just need to let the rest of life experience show us what that lesson is.
When our house burns down, there's not a gift or an opportunity that's, I don't think for many of us, that's clear in the moment. in
Right.
the year. So again, it's not about minimizing the
Right.
tragedy and the pain and the wars that we all fight
Yeah.
internally in our lives. But having that belief that there, at some point,
Mm-hmm.
if I just kind of stay with it, there is a value.
Mm-hmm.
And it certainly makes life a lot easier to kind of tumble through with that kind
Mm-hmm.
of belief that there is
Yes.
something in here in right? Then
Yeah.
it's, I can't lose, quite frankly. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it's a great pill
Yes.
to swallow.
Yeah. So talking about reframing, you brought it up and I wanted to ask you about it more. Is there more that you would say about reframing in general as a technique, especially in work environments that can be
Yeah.
challenging? Is the path to simply look for where the value is, or are there other dimensions or things to talk about when it comes to reframing?
For reframing, yeah. So I'll say, that reframing is one of the singular most powerful approaches one can use in one's life, right? To kind of weather all this stuff. It's a powerful coaching technique. It's a powerful, well, it's, coaching technique and working with clients, right? Is, what's another way of looking at this? Now, it's not about, again, it's not about rose-colored glasses. This isn't about turn that frown upside down or making
Mm-hmm.
lemons out of or lemonade out of lemons.
Yeah.
That kind of easy. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about looking at this very objective thing that's happening in our lives, and or person or whatever, this thing, and bringing a subjectivity to it that allows us to look at it differently. So again, not rose-colored glasses, not painting over this thing. It's not lipstick on a pig, that kind of thing. This is about saying, what are other ways that I can look at this? In positive intelligence, we talk about accessing sage powers in our
Mm-hmm.
mind, and there are 5 sage powers, and they are empathy, innovate, explore, navigate, and activate.
Mm.
There's lots to be said about each of those, but in the reframing that I do and that I work with clients on doing, it's to say, so this challenge that you're facing, let's start with, first of all, empathizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Empathizing with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's a biggie, right? Or empathizing with the other, and then move on to what are the other ways that we could possibly look at this? What are, and so we start to do some innovating, some exploring, navigating,
Mm-hmm.
and then ultimately to end in, so what will you do?
Mm-hmm.
There's also something, this also comes from the work of positive intelligence, that there's the metaphor of, with challenging situations and negative emotions, it's akin to touching a hot stove.
Mm.
And what do we do when we touch a hot stove? We learn from that pretty quickly, and we remove our hand from that hot
Right.
stove.
Right.
And what a lot of us do, especially, again, I'm speaking from my own perspective, as I just want to
Mm-hmm.
own that as a cisgendered gay man of a certain age, growing up in the United States, primarily white, although I claim Latino as well. I'm Colombian. But looking at it through that filter is to start to recognize I can reframe things in a way that work for me. So it's about the positive intelligence framework,
Mm-hmm.
but recognizing that there are ways of looking at, learning from this situation, but not staying with it. That's what I want
Mm-hmm.
to say, is that we tend
Right.
to say, that we tend to be brought into this, again, from my perspective, into this Western world,
Mm-hmm.
Western society of
Yes.
staying with negative
Yes.
feelings. And
Yeah.
that's, to what extent, right?
Right.
So, um,
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question as, coach to mentee, perhaps, or
yeah.
coachee.
Mhm.
I definitely had periods in my life where I was that. I would ruminate and stay with a certain type of story and repeat it for years around a work situation or something like that.
Mhm.
Eventually, through the work of me starting a business that has been a side gig, and then all of this kind of reflective work and a lot of the things that you've been talking about, I feel like I've been making a lot of progress, right?
Right.
And I am sometimes with people or around people or coworkers, colleagues who are still doing that. You know, and I don't know how to serve them. And I
Yeah.
don't even know if it's my role to serve them. And so this is also a message for people in organizations, because I think in a lot of teams in organizations, you'll have people in that team that are leaning in, engaging, using any self-leadership tool that they can. And then you'll have people in the same team who
Yeah.
are ruminating in a story and not helping ultimately the team.
Oh,
Any reactions to that?
yes, a lot actually. So
Okay.
yeah, there's a phenomenon that I've named called the community of complaint,
Mm.
and it tends to happen in organizations. And I think this is getting a little bit towards what you were talking about. It's this idea of people coming together in community, right? In all the best ways of community, supporting, connecting, all that, and it's around complaint. And we do that naturally, right? We have this negativity bias. We automatically go, it's just how we're, again, brought up in this culture, is to focus. And I might say that, the way we've developed as human beings, it makes sense too, right? We go to the negative because, God forbid, that stick in the road is a snake as we're walking.
Exactly. We're protecting ourselves. Yes.
Exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. So it takes some effort to move through that and to reframe in a way. So it's no wonder in life and in organizations and companies, there are people that want to continue to drive the BMW, right? The bitch moaning and whining bus in our car. And we can connect with that. We have a common enemy. So if you and I are on a team, we can talk about the other department or the other boss or the comp.
Right.
And we're like, yeah. And
Right.
it's so easy to connect around. It's kind of like how we connect around the weather. When the weather's bad, that's all we want to
Right.
talk about, is how bad
Right.
the weather is. So we
Right.
do that. So it takes some work to kind of move away from that. The advice that I would give, or the way when I'm working with clients and teams, it's can we talk about what are the values the deeply held personal value or values that are not being satisfied here? Let's start with that.
Right.
So this complaint that you have about our boss, Joe, let's say, I get that. I understand that you're not happy with Joe, but what is it? And what is it about Joe? What is the deeply held personal value or values that you have that are being challenged? And that work, when we can start with that grounding, when we can get to that grounding, is a lot more fruitful, right? A lot more fruitful. Planting complaints and coming, that's fallow ground, right? That's ground that doesn't work. It just creates more and more trouble. But to start with, let's see if we can reframe, and it's tough. I'm not saying it's easy, but to work with folks around what are their values and what are the values that we want to have satisfied and be part, right? So first, clear on your values, then secondly, asking, what value, that's a much more fruitful, right, productive conversation and way of tackling a problem than just complaining about it. That's what I'm thinking. When folks on your team come together around complaint, it's understandable. And is it hard to reframe? Yes. Impossible? Absolutely not.
So do you have a list that you go in with people? This values conversation is interesting to me, and I want to do an entire episode potentially talking about values. It's a question I ask. I ask this at the end of every episode to, what it means to you to be valued in your work and so on. But that's a little bit separate from this question around what are your core values and are you clear on them? And, does this person who's in complaint even understand what's being rubbed up against? And how do you yield that and get it on paper? And so self-awareness exercise.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Yeah, and you're absolutely right, right? So most folks, again, not through any fault of their own, very, very successful professionally, personally, whatever, and have not done the inventorying of their own values to name them, articulate them, own them, and find power in that.
Right.
So the short answer is yes, I do have a list. So there are, in fact, if anybody can Google just values inventory or values list, and there are a lot of lists out there. To your question, to bring in this list and to say to folks, so I'm thinking about a specific, so when I work with, let's say I'm working with a team and they are working on their understanding their own mission as a team, their own reason for why. And part of that includes understanding their values, right? So what is a value statement that we can craft for this team, for this organization? So the very first thing I do is pass out a piece of paper, or, virtually or whatever, with 100 different values, right? In English language, right? Values like, happiness, financial freedom, physical health, collaboration. I mean, all over the board. And then I ask folks to circle their top 7, the things that resonate most deeply for them. And then maybe I ask them to cross off the 2 that don't, that are the least out of the 7. And in that way you've got 5 values, you own them, they're truly important for you. The rest of the team has their values. And now we have, at least it's not overwhelming, we can start to craft. Well, how do we overlap? Are there ways that we can? So I really encourage people when they are doing values work, is to be selfish, really selfish, right? So not about what I should be feeling, but truly, what is it that motivates you here? What is your why in doing the work that you're doing and being on this team? And maybe it is just about, I just need to make enough money to put food on the table, and that's my value. That's
right.
fine. It's transactional. That's fine. It's good to know.
Right. Right. No, I like that you're saying that, because I think removing judgment is important. That needs to be, especially if you're doing a team environment, you don't want to be judged if the money thing is number 1 on your list. It doesn't mean that individual isn't going to be a good contributor, right?
Not at all. No, not at all. That's the premise of the work, is can we first create a psychologically safe environment that we can have these kinds of conversations. It's not as easy as just going in and giving the list or whatever. Because we have our own judge,
right? Exactly.
Ourselves, right? I shouldn't be feeling this,
right?
So a should show, with our own values. And then we have what other folks, how their judgments. And so, no, we need to level. You're absolutely right. We need to do some leveling firsthand. When I work with individual clients, I can do that, right? It's easy. It's not easy, but we can do that. When working with a team, it takes a little bit of work.
Yeah. And it occurs to me that the list is, like you were just saying, that there's this, we're looking at it kind of on a piece of paper, and maybe we are applying judgment and other filters as we're trying to select from a long list. I would think that other work of, like, what are we reacting to when something isn't going well with our boss or whatever, that there are lessons in our emotional responses to things as well, in terms of shining light onto values or things that are being violated that are important to us and such. It's dynamic, right? It's in terms of getting there, I think.
It is dynamic. Yeah. And so much of growth, personal growth, professional growth, team growth. The idea is to keep moving up, but it's dips.
It's messy.
Right? It's dips. It's messy. Exactly. And that's okay. We can embrace that and understand that the important thing is not, it is to keep moving with, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as opposed to 1 step forward, 2 steps back. That's
right.
Right.
Not what we're going for.
It's a lesson in humility. It's a lesson in keeping the learner's mindset, the beginner's mindset, all of that, because this work is, for me, I think it's happy work, right? It's engaging work. It is not easy work. It is for any of us.
Right. I wanted to ask you, in a previous conversation, you had mentioned, it came up around performance reviews, like, sadly, being one of the only places where, things get brought up. What would you say about the performance review process and other ways of operating?
Well, again, I feel so excited about this time in history, the world's history, the US's history, that we are asking these questions now, about how do we think about work, but then how do we measure work, what's important, how to evaluate it. So I'll just say, we've known for a long time that the annual performance review, although it came from a good place, it needs to go the way of the dinosaurs in some ways, right? So if that is happening without an ongoing feedback loop, day to day to day, then the annual review is not only misused, but is dangerous. It's dangerous, right? So nothing breaks my consultant heart more than to hear or coaching heart more than somebody to say, I got all these, I just got my performance review and I didn't know. I didn't know that my boss was thinking that, or the organization was thinking that, or my colleagues were thinking that. They were surprises and they hurt. And I can't, limbic system is fired up with that stuff. I'm not able to make good, clear-headed thinking around that. So much better is to have a company or an organization or a team that really creates a culture of feedback, really nurtures a culture of feedback. Again, easier said than done, but not impossible, right? So it's about understanding how to give and receive respectful feedback, even just understanding what does respect mean, right? That's work in and of itself. That's respect is a culturally imbued word that, different cultures in our, in our workplace, different life experiences approach that word differently. So we got to get clear on what exactly that we want. But the bottom line is this responsibility of having an ongoing culture of feedback where we're able to give and receive challenging, loving, care-filled feedback to each other in the effort of supporting our work and our lives and all that kind of stuff. So it's important. It's so important.
Yeah. And you've said that it's not simple. Is there a framework that you teach as it relates to feedback?
There is.
Can you summarize it for us?
Bet.
Or tell us?
Yeah, you bet. So there's a framework that I lean into often, and it comes from the Center for Creative Leadership. Highly recommend folks get on their list, Google it, get on their list. They're great people doing great work. The framework that they have put together and that I share with my clients is called the SBI framework. So super easy. In fact, your listeners can Google this and just find the SBI video. That's a good kind of primer on this. So SBI stands for Situation, Behavior, Impact. And so let's say, Linda, I'm giving you feedback. I start with the situation. I say, Linda, remember last week at the staff meeting? Do you remember that? So we need to be 100% in agreement around the situation. And then Linda says, yes. And I say, well, do you remember when we were having a conversation about this strategic plan objective, and you and I did not see eye to eye on this, and you used some words like failure, unmotivated, whatever. But the important thing is that I need for you to understand, and we have agreement on what the behavior was. So I'm going to try and be as objective as I can about that, right? It's just the facts around this. And then I get into the impact. So once you agree with, yes, remember the situation, we agree on the behavior, then I say, well, Linda, this was the impact. So the impact on me was I felt disempowered, I felt silenced, I felt cut off. I wasn't able to contribute in the way that I wanted. So this is the impact. And that's essentially, that's the framework, right? It's SBI. So we're making clear. Now, what I build into this and what I encourage you and listeners is to put an R at the end of that, which is the request, right? So Linda, I would like to ask that, the next time we're in a meeting and you disagree with something, I say, can we pause, maybe take a break in the meeting, that you and I can have a conversation offline, whatever makes practical sense for that request, but is to have a request. And the ideal is that in this feedback loop, that first of all, you're giving me feedback and I have to be open to hearing that, even though this is SBI, and that we end with a commitment to a behavior change. And I want to say one more thing. So it's SBIR, but I put an A in front of it too. So I created this new thing called ASBIR, right? Sounds like I think it sounds like a Spanish verb.
Asper, okay.
Yeah. And the A is for ask, right? So Linda, before I give you feedback, I need to ask you, is now a good time for me to give you some feedback, right? Because I want you to be like, right, in the space of being receptive to the feedback. So it's very likely that Linda will say, not right now, that you might say, not right now, 1,000 things are going on. All right, so when can we have a conversation. So you have, as the feedback receiver, you have agency in this. You have agency. We can figure out together when you can be most receptive, and I can also be ready for it. I mean, it's work on both sides, right?
Yeah.
It's for good feedback.
Yeah.
It's you got to be in the right place both ways.
Yeah. So if someone agrees and it's a good time for the feedback, and can there be times when the person on the receiving end, doesn't agree or doesn't like,
Yes.
so then I don't know, are there ways out of that?
Feedback is ideally we end with a new behavior change, but maybe not, right? So, but if I'm going to do the work, quite frankly, of getting ready to give you challenging feedback, the benefit and the reward of that is simply that I'm able to give it to you, whether you accept it or not.
Okay.
That's a whole different thing.
Okay.
Right. Sometimes it's just, I need for you to know this.
Yeah.
And SBI gives us that framework where we start with the objective,
right,
and then move into the subjective, which is a lot easier. As
I
opposed to most people give feedback with judgment. There's
Yes.
judgment right away, and no wonder it doesn't go anywhere.
Right. So this is going back to, taking ownership for what happened. And also being committed ultimately to something greater, that the parties involved here are leaning into growth for themselves personally, growth for the organization, that it is not an attack, that it's really meant for an up-leveling.
Indeed, right?
And not a fixing too. Like I'm cognizant of that too, that it's what I'm responsible for versus, I ultimately I'm not responsible for the other person's behavior. Nor should I be. That's
exactly right. That's exactly right. So you hit on an insight that I really appreciate, is that, oftentimes, well, all the time, and more, in fact, the research is getting clearer and clearer, everybody wants to be seen, valued, and heard in a psychologically safe environment, those kinds of things. So that part of that is leaning into that, so that I want to have the voice so that I am seen, valued, and heard, right? It doesn't mean you have to agree with me, but so that's a good reason to do this work, right? And then the rest of it is, well, that's actually where change happens too, and improvement happens. So maybe we don't see eye to eye 100%, but you have new data. I'm giving you feedback, so you have new data. Ideally, you can make a decision, or with your agency around what to do with that data. It may not be in the moment, especially when if I'm giving you feedback and it's not pleasant, your limbic system, your feelings, your emotions, they're there. So so part of that is empathizing, and again, there's all this work that goes on before we can just start leaning into feedback. We're just going to give each other feedback. We're going to be bulls in a china shop, and feedback here, feedback there, and that's
I try to mention whenever feedback comes up in any conversation that yes, there is going to be this reaction. We might not be able to do anything with it for a period of time, but that there's often some kernel, something in there that something can be used, and you really stripping away whatever you can. There might be elements that don't apply for sure. And there was something else. Oh, I wanted to say too, I heard this research, this statistic a few years ago around the fact that sometimes women don't get feedback because it's thought that they can't handle feedback, and because they don't get feedback, they don't grow. And this can feed into issues around women moving into new, higher, better positions. And I want to call it out as a woman who has difficulty with feedback. I mean, as humans, I think we have difficulty with feedback. We don't want to be judged, but we do want to get better.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So if we can, so first of all, it's a skill, it's a muscle. We got to work on it. It doesn't, as you said, it doesn't come naturally. In terms of having all the power that I think, I hate to say it, but it's true, that straight white men have, in this society, is that there's probably more work that needs to happen. Understandable. That said, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. The work doesn't happen in a vacuum. We've got to figure out what the context is that will best support that. I actually think we're in a very good context right now for you, for women, for, other, I'll own
Other people in any other,
exactly. That's right.
category.
Yeah. As a gay man, it's something that I own. And for me, it's tough to get feedback from straight men sometimes. It just triggers something for me. And it has to do with pain, oppression, all these kinds of things that we all grow up with. So there's, I have my own internalized homophobia and have, dealing with that. You may have your own internalized sexism. I mean, we get these messages, right? So, so there's all the internal work that needs to happen for us to be able to be in the place of giving and receiving feedback in a way that makes sense. So, what you just said, it tears my heart up. It's just, what a shame for not only women, but for anybody that's feeling disenfranchised and on the out, and what a waste, right?
Yeah. At the same time, it's rich, fertile ground. I mean, or, there's a lot of potential.
That's a good reframe.
Just without this, again, I mean, are we expecting some utopian Pollyanna environment? I think it's interesting to watch the changes, even, throughout the time I've been in the workforce. I've seen a lot of change. I mean, and we are in an interesting time right now, as you've said more than once. So, and it's the purpose of our work, right? I mean, me having this podcast, you doing the work that you do, let's build more awareness and create more opportunity and to have more satisfying experience of work and life. I mean, work takes up a lot of hours. We spend a lot of people, and really the discovery for me over the last handful of years that our relationships and these challenging, primary relationship and also these work relationships, they hold the most potential for our personal growth. It's
there you go.
It's
good
really
work
something
to lean into, right? It's with courage, with competence, with rooted, like being rooted. That's the values work. Like I'm coming into this with clarity and strength in who I am. So because it's disastrous, I think, when we engage in this tough kind of work, feedback work, a culture of feedback, when we're shaky, when we're really shaky, right? So we gotta do that grounding first, that rooting.
Anyway, there's so much there. People really need, anyway. Okay.
Well, one of the reasons I'll tell you that I was excited about doing this podcast, and is I think you and I really kind of start with the same premise, right? About work. I remember years ago, this was, oh my God, I was just a kid, just starting my professional career. And there was a poster, and I can't remember for the life of me what the whole poster said, but it called attention to the prison of work. And it's just been a term that's stuck with me. And it's my life mission, and I think it's yours too, to fight that, right? And to know that work can be, maybe it's not the be all end all in terms of fulfillment, but it should certainly be a place that we're giving and getting value, right? Not tolerating, not
Right. And that perfectly segues into the question that I ask every guest around value. And I want to know, for you, Danny, how do you know that you're valued in your work today? And has that changed over the years?
Well, it's very different when one is in a corporate environment or a team environment, which I was, again, for many years. The value came from a lot from external, right? So did I hit my metrics? Is my boss happy? Is my annual review good? By and large, are people, at least to my face, complimenting me or feeling, doing this on one's own? It's a little bit different. So how I feel valued is in having these kinds of rich conversations with folks that I respect, like yourself and colleagues, and feeling like there's that I'm growing in the conversation and that I'm bringing value to the receiving end as well. Of course, there are, that kind of extrinsic motivation and validation is important, right? Whether it's through a team or through conversations. And more importantly is the intrinsic motivation. So at this point, I'm pretty good about thinking that no matter what you say, I know I have value.
Yeah.
I know I bring value, right? I've been doing a lot of that work around
Hmm.
my baseline, and my baseline is, screw it. I'm a value, right?
I
right. I
love it.
have, right. It's an intrinsic sense of
Yeah.
who I am,
Right.
right? And strength. And
Yes.
so as much as I would love it if you liked me and if we had a great
Right.
time,
Right. I love
ultimately,
that. I just, that's what I hope for individual contributors too. I'm not sure that
yeah,
we
no,
all can
yeah,
have that like from day one, like
yeah,
straight out
right.
of college or something. But that, I think that if you can come in with that, some kind of conviction of internal value, whatever your strong character, I don't know. Yeah. And
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So this is, I think you hit on something, right? So you and I have the luxury of being outside of the fray of what goes on in organizations now, right? And companies, right? Because that's a whole thing, right? And it's not, of course, it's not all bad. Most of it can be really good, right? I mean, there's people are being thoughtful. But the onus is on all of us individually to do the work we need to do to get clear on our own trauma, our own lessons, our own value. And so whether that's working with a coach, right? A good coach, if you feel pretty good and you just want to get better and stronger, coaches. But if especially if you've been a trauma survivor or are in trauma, right, is to work with a psychologist, to work with, but to do the work, so that you can bring in the next iteration of your life or the next thing. And I really appreciate what you said, but just coming out of college and you just want to kind of get into the thing but keep doing the work on yourself while you're
mm-hmm,
advancing your career or
mm-hmm,
contributing to the company.
mm-hmm.
Super important, super, super, super important.
Yes. Yes, for sure. For sure. Thank you. I've so enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure we'll
So,
have maybe some conversations in the future. I hope so.
so
I would like to know, can you tell people where they can find you online or elsewhere?
yeah, that would be great. So you can look for me on LinkedIn. It's my first name, Danny, period, Ceballos, Ceballos. And please check out my website to see what I do and what I offer and how I work. It's at unleashedconsult.com, unleashedconsult.com. Either of those channels, you can reach me pretty easily and quickly. And yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Danny. I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day and we have a weekend coming up. So have a great weekend.
Indeed.
All
Thank you,
right.
Linda. This has been a real pleasure.
Yes. Thank you, Danny. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
There you have it. Episode 19 is in the books. And oh my God, I love Danny. He talked all about leadership transformation and ultimately work dope. And my bigger mission that started with Living Blueprints really all is connected with this bigger mission around organizational transformation. Really, just so aligned with Danny and so lucky to have been connected with him in this way. I want to go over a few things, actually a lot of things that we talked about. Well, one, people really do want to shine at work. I think all of us want to shine in some capacity. Of course, based on how we developed, how we grew up, how that's going to manifest is going to change, and it might not look like everyone wants to shine in great ways, but we do ultimately want to shine and stand out. We talked about just how do we manage challenging relationships. Relationships are hard, and we're thrown in with all sorts of people at work. How do we do this? How do we have these skills? How do we get these skills? I like too that Danny shares very personally that, he was in a situation where it didn't make sense to stay in the challenging situation. It was the best move for him in the long run to leave the company. All of what Danny does is about leading yourself. How do you lead yourself best? This is where I ended up with Living Blueprints kind of towards the end. And it seems to me that organizations expect that the front lines can figure this out on their own. And the majority of development funds are pumped into executive leadership. And I feel like this model is just kind of messed up. And of course, I'm probably biased and adding all of my own, chip on shoulder here, but I really feel like everyone in an organization would do better with these skills. I love how when we got into this conversation around enriching experiences, that really Danny was connecting this to a more extended or a more textured definition of happiness, that happiness isn't just fun and it isn't just Pollyanna and smiling all the time. It's about really having enriching experiences of life. It's having that deep connected conversation with a colleague or a friend or a loved one or whatever it is for you. And really, we talked about freedom being connected with this version of happiness, and how can we have integrity around our own happiness? How are we cultivating that? How are we being at choice in every moment and operating in a way that's serving ourselves and serving others? Again, not all elements of a rich life equal fun Pollyanna. It's true, though, and it seems paradoxical, that challenges do bring us happiness in the long run. Challenges provide roots from which we can grow. I love what Danny adds here, that from all challenge, we could or should expect new knowledge, power, or inspiration. Man, I have learned so much from my work environment. Living Blueprints would not exist, and this podcast would not exist if it weren't for my very personal work existence. Danny talked about reframing, and I've talked about this before. When something happens and you're not really at peace with it, you're kind of irked, you feel yourself having an emotional response. Are there other ways that you can look at it? Are there 10 other things that could be happening other than how you've created the story in your head? Create some other stories. Learn from a situation. We don't need to stay with it, though. I've been reading this book. It's called The Book of Joy. It's kind of co-written, it's interviewed style of the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And they talk about pain, and that pain is definitely something that all humans experience. No human is without experiences of pain, physical pain, emotional pain, all of these types of pains. It's when we ruminate in it that we create suffering. The real suffering in life comes from the repeat of this. And I've also have been looking into something called somatic experiencing recently, and there is a physiological effect every time we relive something that is painful. We are actually having a very similar physiological response. So blood is rushing to certain parts of our body. We are tensing in certain parts of our body. We're curling our body, putting it into the fetal position and such. And so when they say the issues are in the tissues, they really are. This is one way that disease manifests. So again, the ability to kind of stop the rumination, it's not simple. I certainly am not providing an awesome solution right here, right now. It's not something overnight, but just know that, I have to remind myself of the damage that we're kind of doing, and based on programming that is in our systems. This is so challenging. And also the empathy and the compassion comes from knowing that this is a form of self-protection. It's part of our biology to do this because, again, we're cringing, we're defending, we feel threatened in a moment, and therefore we are actually physically changing our posture. We're getting rushes of cortisol. So it's how our bodies were designed, but there are things that we can do to try to flip this a little bit. This whole conversation was linked to this community of complaint thing. Again, I have certainly been a member of this community. I really have been working more and more to get away from it. And when I am involved in it, to try to ask questions, to stay as neutral as possible, to be a sounding board. Sometimes people really do need to be heard. And there is a cultural bias, as Danny was mentioning to this, that we are programmed to be a complaining society and people, linked to our need to protect ourselves. And having a common enemy feels good. We band together for certain reasons. It can be harder to elevate above all of this. It takes work. Complaints and the common enemy can feel really good. There are some solutions here. Thinking about what the deeply held values are that are not being met in a situation, whether you are complaining about a boss, what is the actual thing that's happening? Can you really articulate what's not being met, a need, something that's happening in the environment that's not being seen? How can you articulate that first to yourself, maybe to a colleague, and then maybe bring it up? Maybe it's something that boss can't see and just needs some information from the people on the team. I love how Danny was talking about that, really talking from a place of what are the deeply held values not being met, that this can lead us to the more sage part of ourselves. I've also heard this around the wise adult. This is where positive intelligence comes in. And these 5 sage powers around empathy, innovation, exploration, navigation, and activation, taking ownership of what's going on. Complaint is often rooted in something that's real and that we could actually do something about to create something of really, an elevated experience of our lives. Talking about performance reviews, that they can't just stand alone. You need to have frequent conversations with your people. If you are the direct report and you're not getting it, ask for frequent conversations. If you're not sure what those should look like, you can come up with an agenda. I think I talked about this in a previous episode. I'm sorry that I don't have, I'm not mentioning exactly which one this is, but you could definitely Google this type of thing, like what types of things should I ask for in a one-on-one, especially if you're the direct report or if you're the boss and you're not sure what you would talk about as you first get started. Something very, very easy to Google. What are the main goals, objectives, short-term, long-term? How are things going? How can you solve for things? Even if you've scheduled a half-hour meeting and it only takes 10 minutes, that's fine. You could schedule a 15-minute touch point. It's meaningful. It's helpful. It makes it so that you're not just getting feedback once a year. We talked about this whole feedback loop and how sometimes feedback is not received well, but that part of the process in elevating organizations and transforming them is having people have more voice and articulating things. It is part of the change, and part of your own personal change is just the ability to say things. And if you don't, quote unquote, get your way, it doesn't mean that you should have never tried or that you should not have gone through the practice of expressing yourself. I know personally for me, when I get feedback, like my knee jerk, my very, my limbic system, my small child, not the opposite of the wise adult, it has a reaction of like, you didn't tell me, I didn't know, how could I have known that? I have a very helpless type of reaction to things. I'm very, very aware that that's where my lesser side goes. We all have a lesser side. I thought and done a lot of work on mine, so I'm getting to a point where I can talk about it more. So again, I think that this is work that anyone could do, but that combined with my own experience that women close to me in early environments didn't and could not, in fact, handle feedback. I felt like it was my job to protect people from themselves, my job to protect people from whatever they didn't like about themselves. So I do have this kind of two-pronged thing that makes me very resistant to feedback. I'm very, very aware of it. And I'll share, I had relational therapists on in one of my earlier episodes, and my husband and I did this boot camp, and this feedback process was really, really illuminating. And it's so important. And I know that me getting direct feedback from a person who I've spent the most time with, other than my original family, my family of origin, is some of the most transformational work you can do. Of course, you have to feel safe. If you don't feel safe in your work environment to get feedback, this can be a huge challenge, but it is so powerful if you can actually be in a space where you can get honest feedback. Man, it is hard. I want to go back to the point at the beginning. People want to shine, and how they shine, of course, I said it before, it manifests differently, but people want to shine, and that work might not be the end all for our fulfillment, as Danny said, but he said this. He said it should certainly be a place that we are giving and getting value at some level. That should exist. And Danny is very clear that he knows that he's of value and that he's giving value at the point that he is in his life. And he left a job where clearly that wasn't working, but I think that this is what we're going for. He emphasized that it's all up to us as individuals to do the work, that this is a lifelong process, and that your work environment can really be a place where you can have a really, really sharp or even large growing edge. I hope that you are doing well in your work and in your life. You are seeking to up-level the experience for humans in your environment and for yourself, that you are shoring yourself up and you're living your values within integrity, even when things feel like a shit show. As always, please send any comments or messages my way. You can send me a note or recorded message to linda@workdopepod.com. That's Linda at workdopepod.com. Until next time, This is Linda Stacy signing off for Work Dope. Bye bye.